Well, good evening and welcome to First Presbyterian Church of Wilmette. We're glad you're here this evening, whether you're joining us virtually later in the recorded service or here in person. We're honored and delighted to have Reverend Dr. Bruce Rigdon with us. Laura, my colleague, is going to introduce him in just a moment and tell you a little bit more about him. But he is certainly a theological expert and a World Council of Churches expert on Russia, on Ukraine, and as we share feelings of heartbreak and feelings of being appalled over Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, we are holding them all in our hearts and prayers tonight and giving money where we can, but also feeling a little bit helpless as this war enters its second month. A couple of brief housekeeping items. We are going to have note cards that you can write questions on. Just grabbing one here. They're out there if you didn't get one. But if you'll write a question you have for Dr. Rigdon by 7:30, Laura and I are going to stand up at that time and just collect them. And then we'll try to ask a representative set of 5, 6, 7 questions when Dr. Rigdon's finished with his talk. And then we'll have some time afterward for refreshments in our lounge. And we also want to especially thank the Wallace Moore Lecture series that has generously funded this opportunity and look forward to doing more of these in the future. So with that, I'll let Pastor Laura introduce Dr. Rigdon.
Thank you, Jeff. The Reverend Dr. Bruce Rigdon is a Presbyterian pastor, ecumenical leader, social activist, and theological educator, whose area of academic expertise includes the history and theology of the Orthodox churches. He earned his BA from the College of Worcester, his MA, MDiv, and PhD from the Yale Divinity School. Dr. Rigdon served as professor of church history at McCormick Seminary in Chicago from 1974 to 1988, as pastor of Grosse Pointe Memorial Church just outside Detroit from 1988 to 2002, and was president of the Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Detroit from 1997 to 2006. During the Cold War, Dr. Rigdon maintained ties with the Russian Orthodox Church and earned a reputation as one of the world's leading experts on Reformed Orthodox relations. He made his first visit to the Soviet Union in 1961 while he was a theological student. He has been there virtually every year since as a lecturer, seminary leader, or representative of the National Council of Churches. I had the privilege of traveling as a seminary student representative from McCormick on a delegation for the National Council of Churches led by Dr. Rigdon in 1996. And we just had a chance a few minutes ago to catch up a little bit and even spoke a little bit of Russian together. Поговорили по-русски по чуть-чуть. Prior to that trip, I had lived and worked in the former Soviet Republic and later independent country of Ukraine, but I had no real experience with or knowledge of the Orthodox Church. The trip with Dr. Rigdon brought a whole new dimension to my understanding of the former Soviet republics in relation to the Church and enriched my faith in ways that inform who I am as a Christian and as a pastor to this very day. It is my great honor to welcome the Reverend Dr. Bruce Rigdon.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for your kind invitation, and Laura for that generous introduction, and all of you for coming through the rain out there to be here this evening. And I don't know how many of us are with us. How many are with us tonight by Zoom? But I have to say that one of the only benefits I can imagine after what the whole world has been through over these last 2 years is the discovery of Zoom, making it possible for families who are separated and committees that need to meet and all sorts of things to happen while we stayed at home. And I will tell you that as I was getting ready to come here tonight, I realized that it was the first time in a very long while that I have put on a tie and a coat and real shoes as opposed to tennis shoes. So I think I'll begin tonight by emulating my dear friend Mr. Rogers. I don't have any slippers to put on, but I'm going to put my coat behind me. Unfortunately, that may be the last time tonight that we can smile or chuckle, because the topic that's in front of us is so horrendous and so tragic and so heart-wrenching. And for that, what can I say? I apologize. But I do really believe that one of the things that some very good reporters who've been writing excellent things in our newspapers and appearing in our news programs, one of the things that they don't know about very much, if at all, is the religious dimensions of this conflict through which we are now living. I think they're not incidental. As a matter of fact, I think I could make the case that what we're experiencing is, in its very core, a religious war. And it's to that I want to try to address myself tonight. It's true, my first visit to the Soviet Union was in 1961. So I've been about these things now for more than 60 years. And my first motivation had nothing to do with politics or international relations. It had to do with the fact that the more I discovered about the Orthodox community and its faithful members, the more I discovered that they had to share with us very, very rich gifts that we don't even know we are hungry for. And in fact, across the centuries, we have been so separated, east from west, that there's been almost no opportunity for us to get to know them. They perhaps have had to get to know us because they were politically forced for many reasons to do so. So my first connections and my first trips back and forth were primarily to enrich the theological understanding of the two communities. And now, sadly, at what may be soon the end of my career, we are not addressing the contributions that we can make to each other, but how to prevent one another from literally taking perhaps the life of the world itself. Now, to try to give you some idea of what I'm talking about, will you allow me just to take you on a very quick visit to the history of our Russian friends and to tell you about some of the events which have made huge impressions upon them and remain until today very lively in what's happening. The first thing is to ask the question, where do the Russians come from and who are they? That's not an easy question, it's rather complicated, but I can simplify it by saying to you that down the rivers from the north came the Vikings, the people we know as Vikings, who began to settle and build colonies in the area that is now, as a matter of fact, Ukraine. They came down, among other rivers, the Dnieper River. And they began over time to think of themselves no longer as people from the north, but as the Rus, R-U-S, the people who know themselves as the Rus. Now, as they became one people instead of many tribes, they were clearly in need of common culture, common history, things that would hold them together and mold them. And the most important of all of those things was a journey which a committee, they would not have had that word in the 10th century, but anyway, a committee of representatives went to visit all of the world's major religions, at least all those who were near enough that they could go to have contact with them. So they visited Rome, and the Roman Catholic world. And they visited parts of the Jewish community, and they visited some other religions as well. And in their itinerary was the city of Constantinople, then the center of the Byzantine Empire. And when they got back, they told the Prince of Kiev that when they entered the church of Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, they were so taken aesthetically. All of their senses were appealed to, and if you've been around Orthodox worship, you know that that literally makes sense. All of the senses are involved. And they were so overwhelmed by the beauty of it all that they no longer knew whether they were in heaven or on earth. And so the recommendation that they made to the prince was that if for no other reasons, just reasons that had to do with beauty, with the beauty of this world, and the transformation of this world into an even greater beauty, they recommended that their people should adopt essentially Byzantine Christianity. And so, following that report, Prince Vladimir, if you're Russian, or Prince Volodymyr, if you're Ukrainian, went to the Dnieper River with many of his people, and there was a huge baptism, a common baptism. And that was remembered as recently as this last Sunday in the major cathedral in Moscow, the one that was destroyed by the communists in 1933 and rebuilt in the 1990s. It's a beautiful, magnificent church. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, whose name is Kirill, Patriarch Kirill, speaking to all those who were listening in Russia and all those outside the borders, especially those in Ukraine, he talked about the common baptism of the Russian and Ukrainian people, and went on from there, as I'll indicate in my remarks later. Now, I have some personal sympathy with this story, because I still remember my first Easter back in the 1960s in Moscow, my first Easter there among the Russians. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning. I was exhausted physically from standing and from the processions and from all of the things that went on. I was also overwhelmed with it all. It was a beautiful experience. And in those years, as you can imagine, there weren't many men around, and there weren't many children around. It was not a good time for the church. The church lived under oppression, the oppression of the Marxist-Leninists and the Communist Party. So I was standing beside a little old lady, someone in Russian who would be referred to as a matushka, a grandmother, an old lady. And I remember turning to her and saying in the best Russian I could muster, "This was one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had." And she smiled, a broad smile from ear to ear, and said, "Oh, if you like this, you're going to love heaven." And I walked away laughing, but also thinking how much wisdom there was in that comment. So that's part of the background. These are people that we now refer to as Slavs. The Principality of Kiev grew into a very important state that lasted for about 2.5 centuries until an invasion from the east wiped it out. And eventually, after a long walk through the Russian wilderness and from one city to another, Russian history landed in Moscow, and Russia itself came into being, and eventually what we know as the Russian Empire. Now, for a long time, it was under Greek tutelage. The bishops were all Greek-speaking. But in the 16th century, the 15th century, in 1453, you may remember from your world history, Constantinople was captured by the forces of Islam. And so, as is true until this day, the center of Eastern Christianity in what is now called Istanbul, became a community with a patriarch and a relatively small number of believers, all of whom are Greeks. But the person who sits in that chair in that church is called the ecumenical patriarch. Orthodoxy consists of 16 more or less independent churches, and they believe in conciliarism, so their governance is not by a pope, but by the gathering of the heads and representatives of all these churches in council, which happens periodically, not so long ago, as a matter of fact, the most recent one. And there they sit together and make decisions about theology and church order and all sorts of things that come before them. Well, in 1453, with the fall of the Second Rome, I need to explain that. By this time, what we know as the Roman Church had withdrawn from that conciliar fellowship. So what was left were the Eastern churches over there, and the Roman Church over here, and the Roman Church obviously saying then, as it says now, that it is the only true church of Jesus Christ, and that it is divided now, and that those in the East, though clearly Christians, are not part of the one holy Catholic Church as represented in Rome. So from the point of view of the Russians, the first Rome had fallen by virtue of going off by itself. And now, Constantinople in its last hours had appealed to Rome to send armies to save them from the Muslims. And from the Russian point of view, that was the second Rome falling. And so a sort of myth developed, which has always been there in the background and is now somehow emerging again. It is that Moscow is the third Rome and the only Rome which will never fall into faithlessness. In that you can clearly hear, if nothing else, a messianism. And that messianism is, I think unfortunately, to this day, a part of the consciousness of the Russian Orthodox Church. But when the church is in its healthiest state, that's only a rumble in the background. Now, since it is not in its healthiest state, the rumble begins to be louder and closer to the patriarchal throne. Now I want to remind you of a man that you do know about, Peter the Great. Peter was the only czar, all 6'8" of him. He was the only czar who had been able to travel in the West, and he fell in love with the West. He loved the way Dutch people built ships. He loved the way, he visited in Holland and in Germany and in England and in Italy, and wherever he went, he fell in love with something that those people did as part of their genius. And on his way back to, not Moscow, on his way back to Moscow, he made several decisions. Basically, he concluded, Russia's only hope for the future was in Westernizing. So he, as emperor, as the czar, he must bring about this Westernization, and it must begin with leaving Moscow behind and building a completely different place on which Russian identity would be based. So he built St. Petersburg, a swampy place where nobody believed that anything could be built, much less a great city, and on the backs of the serfs, of course, at great human cost. St. Petersburg was born. And then the Tsar did a whole lot of other things. He told men, Russian men, if they wanted to meet him, they had to shave, no more beards. He told all the Russians in his court to take off their old Russian coats and to put on French wear and to look and smell like Frenchmen. And beyond that, he established industries of all kinds. And the message was clear to everybody who could hear it. Russia's future depends on Westernizing. So, though Russia did not emulate the democracies, the growing democracies in the West, Catherine the Great was very interested in that and read all of the great French philosophers about democracy and so on, but she finally had to put the books aside and settle on Russia as an autocracy. By the time one reaches the 19th century, the Russian Intelligentsia, remember it's the mid-19th century, whatever your feelings about Russians may be, I think you'll agree with me that Russian civilization has produced astonishing musicians, novelists, poets, operas, everything in the way of culture by the 19th century, Russians were doing with really amazing genius. But among their intelligentsia, by the midpoint in the century, a split had occurred. One group you could predict. They were the followers of Peter the Great, and hence they were called the Westernizers. From their point of view, the only thing wrong was that Russia wasn't Westernizing fast enough and more completely. So those Westernizers, who were by far the majority, reached the 20th century, and under the impact of two revolutions, almost all of them became Marxist-Leninists, joined the revolution and the party, and the rest is history. They left behind a much smaller group, but a group that fascinated me from the time I first heard about them, and they are called the Slavophiles. If you're interested after tonight and you want to do any further reading about this, their founding father was a man named Alex Stepanovich Kamyakov. They were called Slavophiles. Let me caricature them slightly in order to be quick. They were a group of intellectuals who said, Russian friends, look, do you really want to be like the West? How could you possibly want to look like the West? It's full of slums, it's full of disease, it's full of unemployment, it's full of poor people. Who would want to be part of a civilization as sick as it obviously is? So Peter was wrong. He got it wrong. And he did so because he didn't know our traditions and our history and our culture well enough. We're Slavs. We're not Frenchmen. We're not Englishmen. We're not Italians. We're Slavs. And there is a genius to being Slavic. And it's to be found all the way back to the time of the baptism of Prince Vladimir. We are a people who believes in communal rights. And if we have to choose between individual rights and communal rights, be sure we'll always choose the community. Well, maybe I can give a clue to you by using one word. There's a strange word in Russian. Strange because it has so many meanings. The word is mir, M-I-R. Mir can mean a village. Mir can mean peace. In the peace movement, the peace movement among Slavs is called the Mir movement. It can mean, I'm sorry about that.
Keep talking.
Okay. It can mean the world. So it goes in its meaning from village to world. But above all, what it connotes is something I really still don't know how to translate. The word in Russian is sobornost. And essentially what it means is the relatedness of all things, but especially all human beings, in a community whose roots and realities are to be found in Christianity, Eastern Christianity. Now let me move ahead to our century. As Laura will remember, because she was there and witnessed it, the early 1990s were a time of enormous change in Russia and terrible suffering. What I do remember about my trips there in the early 90s was coming up out of the subway and seeing all the matushkas, all the grandmothers, standing on the steps as you arose out of the underground. And they had shoes or flowers, anything that they could find that they wanted to sell you because they were so desperate they really didn't even have money for dinner. And I remember the agony of my friends who said, we feel as if we're sandwiches and we're in the middle. We have to care for the older generation who no longer have homes because the homes that they had were given them by the state, and that's all gone. They no longer had free medical care. They no longer had anything. And the money that they had put in the bank was worthless, so it was up to the middle generation in the sandwich to keep alive the older generation, and at the same time to reach toward their children who would now have to pay for education, and especially any kind of higher education, and that had never been true before either because the state provided all the education that you were capable of absorbing. So I know personally among my friends how painful the 90s were. In the midst of them, in the city that had been called Leningrad and was once again called St. Petersburg, there was a man who entered civil service whose name was Putin. Now, who he is not nearly as clear as it appeared to be a year ago. Because a year ago, everybody believed that he was born of parents in Leningrad who were sort of heroic parents and with the rest of the city, lived through those awful years of the isolation of Leningrad as it was surrounded by Nazi troops. Now it appears, I'll just tell you this because it's at least a juicy rumor, now it appears he may in fact be Georgian. And he may in fact be the son of a Georgian woman out of wedlock who was unable to care for him as a child, so he was sent to her parents, who, when they could no longer afford it or manage it, somehow got him to St. Petersburg, where he was adopted. I don't know that it matters, but it's simply to say many things about Putin are not nearly so clear as we once thought. In any case, he entered the civil service, and the rest is history. He became, as of today, one of the most powerful and terrifying leaders the world has ever known. Putin needed something desperately when he left the KGB behind and saw the Soviet state fall apart. If he was going to be political, he had to have a political philosophy from which to operate. What would that be? He couldn't any longer follow Peter the Great. Westernization is our future. That wouldn't work. But he had to have something. And what he discovered, my friends, no one that I know of has said this, but you're hearing it from me, and I believe it's true. He discovered Slavophilism. And he discovered what a wonderful philosophy and framework it was for the work that he had to do in restoring Russia and what lay beyond that as his larger goals. Now remember that one of the first tenets of Slavophilism is that the West is evil and becoming more evil by the day. The West is sick and becoming sicker by the day. And if you heard Putin's last speeches, they're not different from his first speeches, but it's more and more impactful now. He talks only about the West. That's all of us. He talks about us as if we are a cancer on the skin of the human race. And that above all, what Russia must do is keep the Slavic world from being infected by this terrible, disease-ridden, immoral reality that's rising in the West. Now, who would his friends be? Well, I will just tell you that one of his friends was a seminary student when I taught for a while in Russia, So I've known him all his life, and he is the present patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And his ecclesiastical name is, I'm having a blank. Patriarch Cyril. Patriarch Kirill. Now, Patriarch Kirill has also come up through the ranks in a church which during the 20th century, he was alive for the second half of the 20th century, was completely under the control of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And if we had time, by the way, tell me when I've reached my 45 minutes and I'll try, okay? When Kirill, was coming up, he's about 11 years younger than I am, it was quite clear to me that he was KGB, and that some of the phone calls that he made to me about issues in the Central Committee of the Royal Council of Churches, he was just not calling me as a matter of opinion. He had been instructed by someone in the KGB to do so. And you would be hard-pressed, I think, to find anybody in the Russian church in the 20th century who was not in some way, in order to exist, in relation to the KGB, some more obedient and some more resisting. My favorite patriarch died in the first decade of this century. And so for the first time, there was going to be a meeting of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church to choose the next patriarch. I won't go into details about this. There were three men running. One was a man who I considered a saint, still do, and he was the Metropolitan Archbishop in Minsk in Belarus. The second was the current patriarch, and the third was a man who had been the Metropolitan Archbishop of Kiev, to speak of it in Russian terms, and who was not himself, he was Russian. At the time of the election, he was exposed. He was exposed for being the highest-ranking KGB officer in the Russian Orthodox Church, for being secretly married. Orthodox priests may marry, but bishops may not. He was secretly married and had 2 children. And beyond that, let me use a euphemism to say it quickly, he was a gangster. He was a gangster archbishop, and I had felt the impact of his rod every time I went to meetings, because this was during the Vietnam War period, earlier, and he was under orders by the KGB to attack anyone and everyone who came from the United States to the meetings, so I knew him rather well. They finally defrocked him and excommunicated him. So at the end of this process, from a Russian point of view, he was no longer even a member of the church, much less a priest. He went back to Kiev and proclaimed himself to be the patriarch of a brand new Ukrainian Orthodox church. And he got a few followers. And to make a long story short, if you look today in Ukraine, you may or may not be aware of this, the vast majority of the churches, the Orthodox churches in Ukraine, are churches that exist under the Moscow Patriarchate through the Metropolitan Archbishop of Kiev, who is in that line of succession. That's the vast majority. This man, along with his cronies, had organized a church, I'll say it very bluntly, which was based simply on Ukrainian nationalism, and which claimed to be an Orthodox church but was not recognized by any Orthodox church in the world. And then, for reasons which I cannot easily explain, 2.5 years ago, the ecumenical patriarch, you remember him, the man in Constantinople, he recognized this little nationalistic church as the authentic church of the Ukraine. And that threw the whole Orthodox world into one of the worst events of the last 1,000 years. You may not be aware of this, but the Russian patriarch, Kirill, excommunicated or cut off all fellowship with the man who essentially is the Eastern Pope. He's not a pope, but he's the primus inter pares, the first among equals. Now, if nothing else, that has divided the Slavic world from the Greek world in Orthodoxy. If anybody cares, in Chicago, legally, Greeks can no longer take communion in Russian churches, and Russians can no longer take communion in Greek churches, and that's never, never, never happened before in Orthodox history. And it's especially painful in Orthodoxy because the unity of the church is one of the most important things for which the community stands. So where has this ideology, first of all, let me say, in the times that I've been in Moscow, I'm amused because I think of Kirill, the student whom I knew years ago, and Putin as the Babsi twins. They occupy the two largest automobiles in Moscow. They're the only ones who don't have to obey any traffic signals. I'm sure that they are both multi-millionaires. It goes back in a way to what I think is the essential weakness of Orthodoxy. It was a decision centuries before that the church exists to protect the state. The church exists to sanctify the state, to pray for the state, and the state exists to protect the church. Consequently, church and state, for good or ill, come together like this. And after a century of Christians suffering, as they did in the 20th century, from atheistic governance and ideology, now the church has emerged and is by far the largest national church in the world and by far the richest church in the world. Let me just give you one statistic. Every day since the year 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church has opened 3 new churches, either by building them or by repairing them, the ones that had been destroyed in the 20th century. So there stand today new cathedrals in London, in Paris, in the Riviera, in the city of Havana in Cuba, giant cathedrals. And if one asks, how is it possible for a church to be wealthy enough to do that, the answer that you hear in Russia is the Russian people love the church and are generous givers. And if you believe that, I'll get you a ticket to the circus next Sunday. It's clear to me that, again, with this commingling, the state has to be involved in some of this. By the way, the most recent cathedral in Moscow is the Cathedral for the Armed Forces. It's beautiful, and the patriarch has been hanging out there very regularly recently with beautiful liturgies praying for the Russian armed forces. Well, where you get, my friends, at the end, and with this I'll try to pull all the threads together, there is an ideology at the center of all this. And the ideology, if I summarized it, would be something like this: one holy people on one holy ground in one holy church. And I'll leave it at that. It is a kind of messianism which suggests that Slavs have something. Well, if I were going to be ironic, I'd say something almost as unique as what Americans believe we have. A special mission in history which only the Slavs can perform. And for them to do this thing, which in the end I suppose is going to sanctify the whole world, the family of Slavs must all be together. Now that lends itself then to the argument that Ukraine, that's funny. Let me tell you something. When I first went to Russia, and we were interpreting from Russian to English, I always said the Ukraine. You may now know that that's a no-no. You don't call it the Ukraine. That would be like saying the South. It is a nation, and consequently you speak of it simply as Ukraine. But from a Russian point of view, it is still the Ukraine. It's the South Slavs of the Slavic Russian family. So if you'd asked me before all this terror broke out, what's really at stake here, I would say Putin has bought into this ideology, hook, line, and sinker. He's decided to make himself the messianic figure in the center of the destiny of this ideology. And if all that's true, he must bring back Crimea, he must bring back Ukraine and make it the Ukraine again, and then he must get Belarus, which will not be very difficult because Belarus is already in his pocket. I would have guessed that that could have been, at least for the first stage, the only thing that Putin had in mind. It's bringing together not the whole of the Russian Empire, but the Slavic parts of the Russian Empire. And of course, you know, and I agree, that one of the things he's angry about is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He considers it the great tragedy of the 20th century. So I won't deny that beyond that, there may have been hopes that he could reach out and get more than his portion of the Slavic areas, east and south. Kirill, therefore, every Sunday, I listen to him. The sermons never condemn Putin, despite the fact that the head of the World Council of Churches, who is himself an Orthodox priest, has begged Kirill to say a word about Putin and to say something stronger. And the stronger thing that he wants to say is, dear Russian Slavic friends, the West is sick. It is morally terrible. Do you know that in the West there are people who believe in abortion? Do you know that they have gay parades where homosexuals are accepted as normal parts of society? In other words, when I look at that, all the things we have fought for in our churches for the last 40 years are, from Kirill's perspective, signs of our liberalism, which has left the Christian faith behind, and our embracing things which have to do with immorality and with illness. So I do not expect to hear Kirill do more than pray for peace. He will do that. And last Sunday's sermon ended rather dramatically with Kirill begging the brothers and sisters in the East, that is in the Ukraine, to come home to Mother Russia. Among other things, that suggests to me how out of touch both the patriarch and Putin are to the realities, and how incredibly blind and uncaring they appear to be about little children and their mothers fleeing across borders and cities disappearing or being heavily bombed night after night after night. And in my soul of souls, I still have a special place for Slavs and for the best parts of the Orthodox tradition, which have nothing to do with the history that I've just described to you. And if you ask me, where is all of this going? Like everyone else, I fear the button. I fear that Putin, under the extraordinary pressures that exist now, may in fact have lost his mind and may not be making rational decisions. And I think that's very dangerous indeed. So I wish that I could leave you with something more hopeful. Maybe with your questions you'll enable me to do that, but that's my presentation tonight. By the way, that whole ideology is summed up in 2 words, and I have seen it in print here in the United States twice now. It's called Ruski Mir, Russian world. But it's more than world. It's the Slavic reality.
Thank you,
Okay.
Dr. Thank you, Dr. Rigdon. We have a few questions that have been submitted that we'll do our best to get to before our time is over. One question from someone who asks about Patriarch Kirill. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Asking Patriarch Kirill, how does he justify the deaths of so many fellow Slavs? Do the sins of the Ukrainians, in his mind, justify their deaths? How does that calculus work theologically?
It's a very good question, and I'm the wrong person to answer because I'm so profoundly sympathetic with the question. I can only tell you what I see on the surface. What Kirill tells all of his listeners, and that's people all over Russia and Eastern Europe, and anybody else who's listening, the West is so sick. And the problem with the Ukraine, I haven't spoken much about Ukraine tonight, but you may know, Ukraine could easily be divided into two parts, at least before all this conflict began. The western part of Ukraine has been a part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. It has also belonged to the Austrian Empire. It also experienced the Nazi occupation with perhaps understandable joy because it saw the Nazi invading armies as liberators. So the west of Ukraine, it's very clear to me why they would never, ever want anything to do with Russia. The eastern part of Ukraine, however, has been part of Russia and the Russian Empire since the middle of the 17th century. And in my first years in the Soviet Union, saying that you were Ukrainian was like saying you were Belarusian or you were from some other part of the Soviet Union. It didn't mean that you were, it would be like my identifying myself as a Pennsylvanian. Didn't mean more than that. I did, however, toward the end begin to sense the conflict that was present between some groups of Ukrainians and Russians. So what the patriarch tells his people in his sermons and in his lectures is that the Ukraine is being infiltrated by the West. And that the result of that is very clear. Ukrainians are becoming Westerners. And that means that they're embracing all the awful things that are part of the Western sickness. Above all, did you see last summer, he tells the Russian people, in Kiev, they actually had a parade of the gays. For him, that's a terrible, terrible thing. And so he predictably says the Russian mission in Ukraine is to bring people away from the West and its evil influence and back to Russia with the profound Christian tradition that it represents. I don't know how many Russians believe that anymore, but that's what he says.
The next question is two parts. Were you in Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And could you please give your views on Putin versus Khrushchev?
What an interesting question. No, I was not in Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was at home during that whole period, but I was there on either side of it, so I certainly experienced it in relation to Russians that I knew. Let me answer it in a way that may seem strange to you. We felt very, very nervous, to put it mildly, that 90 miles from our shore was a Soviet presence. And we were not about to stand for that, and we made global fools of ourselves in one sense. I'm not talking now about the deciding moment, but I'm talking about the attitude to Russia toward Cuba, which still is part of our foreign policy. I'm appalled that that's the case. Now imagine if you're Russian And NATO, which you understand to be basically the foreign policy of the United States of America, is not only in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia on your borders, but is now about to be open to receiving Ukraine into NATO membership, which would mean that a very large section of the Russian border, we are right there, across a bridge, across a river. So before all this hell broke loose, one of the things that I was saying was how foolish I thought we all had been, the West, as they say, for driving right up to the border. It could only result in very bad consequences, and that, of course, is exactly what happened. I realize that some people are saying now that Putin only used that as an excuse, and that may well be. But nonetheless, any Russian that I know of, including my own friends, would be very nervous at the thought that all along their western border, the United States was a stone's throw away.
Next question, Dr. Rigdon. It's actually a question from me. As you were talking about the Orthodox Church in Russia in particular, and how there were some folks that under the KGB had to be more obedient, you might say, and some were more resistant. What signs of resistance are you seeing now, and what signs of hope maybe are you seeing in the Russian Orthodox Church and maybe in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the midst of so much carnage and holy war?
That's a wonderful question, and I wish I had more information to answer with. My son spent several years in Russia. In the beginning, it was the Soviet Union, and then he stayed on into Russia. As a result, he has a whole collection of friends, and he's talking with them by phone every day these days. So I depend pretty much, for whatever measure I have of public opinion, on him. And he says that by and large, among the friends with whom he talks, he can tell how little access they have to accurate information. That's problem one. They really don't know an awfully lot about what's been going on. Secondly, though they are not people who are Putin supporters, they nonetheless spoke to him very angrily about the issue that I just talked with you about. What are we trying to do, moving right in on their borders? If you've been part of a nation which has been invaded 200 years ago by the French and 100 years ago by the Germans, I think it's understandable that you might want to have some space between yourself and whoever the next invader may be. That's why I have some sympathy with that. But there is public resistance happening in the Ukraine. Some of my friends I've talked to who are priests. These are priests within the Moscow Patriarchate, so they're not part of what I've called the bandit church. May God forgive me for using that term, but I just distinguish them that way. These are Orthodox priests who are presumably obedient to the Patriarch, and they have stopped praying for the Patriarch in their liturgies. Now, that may not make much sense to you, but one of the most powerful things in every Orthodox liturgy is the moment when the diptychs are sung. That means you sing the prayers for the heads of each of those churches by name, because a person's name identifies his community. So you pray for the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And these, his very sons, liturgically and ecclesiastically speaking, have stopped praying for him. And that means that they sense something so wrong that they can no longer, in front of their congregations and from their hearts, pray for someone who is inflicting all of this. They have also begun actively to pray for and to bless Ukrainian troops. So in Ukraine, I think it's quite obvious that no matter where you stand in the spectrum of orthodoxy, what has happened is so terrible that you simply are in opposition to everything, even ecclesiastical things coming from across the border. In Russia itself, there have been demonstrations, you've seen them, and they involved several thousand people, which I thought was impressive. But everyone now who publicly speaks anything but the approved line is arrested and sentenced to 16 years in prison. And even with that, it's still happening. So there is resistance. How much, how profound it is, I don't know, except that in another sense, the whole of Ukraine, of course, is in resistance, is to put it mildly. And remember that Ukrainians, and the people in eastern Ukraine, many of them are Russians. That's why Putin thought once his tanks crossed the borders, people would be waving flags and welcoming them and looking forward to returning to Russia. And that was one of his greatest miscalculations. He has, by what he's done, achieved exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He wanted to divide NATO. NATO is stronger and more united than ever. He wanted to bring all of Ukraine, or at least part of Ukraine, home to Mother Russia, and now even the Russians in Ukraine do not want to return and will resist and fight. So that's what gladdens my heart on one side, and on the other side makes me more frightened, because in the isolation that it creates for him, only God knows what this man will do. I've tried to find out whether there is anyone standing between him and the button, and I've called and talked to some people in Washington. Nobody seems to know the answer to that, and that's even scarier.
I had heard that, Putin had said prior to the invasion that they would be greeted as liberators.
Yes.
I thought that was a talking point. So you're saying he actually believed that?
You know, people ask me one of the toughest questions of all, is Putin really a Christian? And I can tell you, I was there in the cathedral the first year that Putin showed up, as now he had announced himself to be a baptized Christian, and he was there to celebrate Easter. Part of the mythology, it may be true that he's woven around himself, is this could be quite genuine. When he was an infant, he says, his mother took him secretly to an Orthodox church and had a priest baptize him. I heard that story thousands of times. I believe it happened. At least other people, maybe to him as well. What he discovered was, of course, that the priest who baptized him was the father of the present patriarch. That begins to sound almost more than my predestinarian background allows me to accept. So the question, what does Putin really believe, and what does he believe out of necessity? It's like another puzzling question. Did Putin create this mess, or did this mess create Putin? And I think you could argue that for a long time. So what Putin actually believes, I don't know, but I think it's possible that he has convinced himself that this old ideology kept alive in the back rooms of the churches is something so valuable, it allows him to claim something approaching divine authority for what he's doing.
Dr. Rigdon, a question about Judaism in particular. One of us wondered, how did the large population of Russian Jews come into being? And then does Zelensky's Judaism, the president of Ukraine, is that his name? Does Zelensky's Judaism play a role in this whole conflict, in your mind?
Well, again, my answers may surprise you. Let me preface my response this way. I have found a great irony in the recommendation that Israel should become one of the nation states that tries somehow to mediate and bring us out of this conflict. And the reason I find that so strange is that it seems to me, if you look at the dynamics of Russia invading Ukraine, You have on a much larger stage what happened in Israel years ago. And Israel is the only country I know that has kept a non-Jewish population under military occupation for more than 60 years. And I find that there's a certain irony in asking them to become the peacemakers in something that has such striking parallels. But you may want to string me up for that answer. It's one of the strange accidents of history that Jews in Middle Europe did find a place to stay, not a very pleasant place. The Pale of Settlement, you know about the Pale of Settlement, that's in Ukraine. And that's where in the late 18th and 19th centuries, that was the place where all Jews had to live, whether they liked it or not. And they could only practice certain professions and so on and so forth. So understandably, many of the Jews in Russia and in Ukraine left as soon as they could after the Second World War. And now the third largest language in Israel is Russian. And it's a very sizable Russian population. And obviously there are kinships that have been kept that I assume are still strong. I don't know whether that answers the question or not.
Thank you.
This will be the last question. You shared your fears, your greatest fear. I think we all share that. Many of us do. But how do you think the conflict will end?
Well, answers could range from a terrible day when a madman will press a button and we will all have to learn horribly what it means to live in a world where nuclear war has become a real possibility. I pray with all my heart to God that through whatever means we will not face that. Short of that, it's hard for me to imagine because Putin has lost everything. I mean, I can't think of one thing out of this mess that is going to be used to allow him to bring the troops home and to act as if he won something. He hasn't won anything. So secretly, yeah, I guess I need to say secretly, my hope is that someone somehow will be able to bring him down and out of power quickly and soon, and that there will be someone wise enough, I don't know who that is, who could keep Russia then from slipping into complete anarchy. Because it's clear to me that the people around him are people of relatively little skill. They're all his captives and his yes persons, and I don't think any one of them probably has the wisdom or the possibility of creating a new Russian state. At that point, maybe this is one positive thing I can say, at that point I hope we will be smart enough, if that should happen, to move in with all of our resources and help the Russian people to recover. Because remember, in the Second World War, more Russians died than all the rest of us put together. And my generation, which lived through that, is now disappearing. But nonetheless, they've been able to keep the memory of that alive in the new generation. And the other thing that Russians remember is that everybody else after the war got help from us. And how glad I am we offered that help to allow for European recovery. The Russians got not $1. So this time I hope we'll be smarter if we are fortunate enough to have that opportunity. I think then we need to do everything we can. And maybe in an ethos like that, my long postponed hope will happen that Christians in East and West will talk with each other about life and death and things that really matter, and learn from each other and bring down the walls that constantly separate us.
Amen.
Amen. I think that's a wonderful place to end.
Yeah.
Let's thank Dr. Rigdon.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful time.
Thank you very much for coming, and if any of you would like to stay later, I'm game for more talk.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Rigdon. I'd like to close us in prayer, and you're invited to linger for a little while. If you're able, we'll head to the lounge, which is straight out the sanctuary to your left. There's a restroom there if you need it, and some refreshments that have been prepared by a couple folks. So let me close us in prayer. Almighty and all-vulnerable God, God of many names and places, we pray to you tonight, asking for peace for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Russia, for people everywhere and every place. We pray in particular for the children, women, and men in harm's way, suffering the horrifying violence and displacement of war. Help each one of us nestled safely here in this corner of your world not to be cynical or apathetic, not to feel helpless by what we cannot control. Instead, help us to do what we can, to pray, to give money, to speak up, to keep humanizing both the victim and the oppressor, to embody the ways of peace in our own lives, our own relationships, our own communities. Thank you for Dr. Rigdon's inspiring talk tonight. And now we close with the words from a prayer by John Philip Newell. To the home of peace, to the field of love, to the land where forgiveness and right relationship meet. We look, O God, with longing for earth's children, with compassion for the creatures, with hearts breaking for the nations and people we love. Open us to visions this night we have never known. Strengthen us for self-givings we have never made. Delight us with a oneness we could never have imagined, that we may truly be born of you, makers of peace. In all the holy names of God we pray, and let all the people say together, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, friends. Linger as you're able. Peace be with you.